are now live on YouTube. So I think this is episode 45, amazingly. I think it's 45. And tonight we're going to be talking about what's called senescence. And senescence is essentially a type of cell. We're going to be talking about these cells that become senescent. And when these cells become senescent, they do all these kinds of bad things to our body. And I'm making it as simple as possible. We'll use several analogies tonight so that you can get a better understanding of what these cells are. But essentially what's going on is there are certain cells in your body that become what's called senescent. And when they become senescent, they just sort of slow down. And unfortunately, when they slow down, they start interacting and interfering and actually causing the cells around them to become diseased as well. We'll go into why this is a problem, but we'll also talk about what we can do about it as well. And we'll see that there are various shared pathways between what's going on with various anti-aging strategies, because essentially this is a natural part of aging. And if we can attack a certain natural part of aging, then it improves our ability to age. We age slower. We age with in a more healthful way. So let me share my screen. Oh, and by the way, behind me, this is the Baha'i temple in Haifa, Israel. So a place I visited a while ago from the religion is called the Baha'i faith. I didn't know much about it until I visited this really incredibly beautiful temple and gardens in Haifa. And I don't know, I was thinking about it today and I figured, well, I was sort of reminiscing about my trip to Israel and visiting this place, and said I'll put it as my background. Really incredibly beautiful place. All right, so let me share my screen and we'll get back on topic. One moment. All right, so you should be able to see my screen. And I've actually changed the subject of tonight's episode to zombie cells and how to get rid of them. And the reason I chose those words is because these cells that I'm talking about, which are, again, a natural part of aging, and I hesitate to use the word natural because they end up, although that it happens sort of as a natural consequence of things, there are things that you can do to avoid getting so many of these cells. And these are called zombie cells essentially because, well, we'll get into that in a moment, but essentially they act like zombies and they're able to convert other cells into zombies as well. So let's talk a little bit first about this concept of should aging be treated? Now, a lot of people immediately have the feeling or the sensation emotionally that, well, aging is natural, and so we shouldn't really be spending a lot of time, trying to reverse aging because it's sort of a natural process. And my answer to that is that we really need to look at things from various different perspectives. And this is just 4 different perspectives that we can look at aging by. There are many, many others that we could look at it by. But I want you to think to yourself right now, should aging be treated? And let me know, just keep in mind sort of how you feel about that. Because often when I talk about it, people have this reaction like, well, I don't want to live forever. Is it not natural to be able to try to reverse some of the aging process? I mean, after all, it happens, quote, naturally. So are we sort of contravening, the natural order of things in some unfair or unnatural way? Those are often sort of the ideas that people get when they think about aging. Now, I'd like to look at that question from 4 different perspectives. The first is immune function. So let's talk a little bit about immune function. And of course, that's front and center right now with the COVID epidemic. And the reason it is because we know that people who are elderly or have complicating secondary conditions are having a great deal of trouble getting rid of COVID or having trouble, I should say, surviving COVID, unfortunately. Now, the reason for that is because of a decline in immunity. Now, I spoke about this at length on another one of our episodes in the 20s, episode somewhere in the 20s. You can find that on my YouTube channel if you're interested, where we went through really actually in great detail, really what happens to the immune function with aging. The point I'm trying to make here is that that is something that can be reversed, and at least it can be helped. So if we're thinking about immune function, and we think about it that way, and there are certain things that we can make changes in that are going to impact our immune health, whether that's things like zinc or vitamin D or getting enough rest or whatever the case may be, these things that improve immune function, is that in any way abnormal to correct that? And I think the answer, of course, is no, because ultimately, none of us can know how long we're going to live. There are too many factors involved in the length of someone's life. However, we should really look at it from a quality of life perspective. And in that way, we can see that it makes complete sense to be able to correct some of the deficiencies that happen as a result of natural aging. So that's immune function. I think all of us can now hopefully agree, and if anyone has any questions or comments, please type them into the box, that there's nothing unnatural about fixing some of the immune dysfunction that occurs as a result of aging. Now let's talk about functional movement. We do know that there's something called sarcopenia that happens as you get older, which is where your muscle actually gets replaced by fat, which then reduces and this happens naturally as you age. Quote, naturally. And of course, this is a natural phenomenon. Your muscles slowly turn into fat, more so than they would be when they are younger. As a result of that, you can get decreased functional movement, of course. And as a result of that, then there's an increased risk of falls, and there is an increased risk of actually bone density issues as well, because the actions to be able to increase functional movement, which is doing exercise and building some muscle so that you're not getting so much fat replacing your muscle. By doing that, you're able to increase your bone density. You're able to continue, at least hopefully maintain a certain minimal amount of functional movement. And that is a way of treating aging. So I think we can agree that there's nothing unnatural about treating quote, natural declines in functional movement. And we try to preserve that functional movement as long as we possibly can by doing exercise in various different ways. Now let's move on to metabolic health. Now, metabolic health essentially means ultimately how you're processing energy, how you're using energy. And really, as we know that we've spoken about for quite some time, over multiple episodes, you're burning either sugar or you're burning fat. And if you are over burning sugar and not capable of burning fat, we've spoken about that before. That's what we call metabolic inflexibility. Metabolic flexibility is where you're able to burn sugar and burning fat. And there are certain things that you can, if you just are chronically burning sugar and you're unable to turn on burning fat, that is associated with an increased risk of rapid aging. So I ask you, should aging be treated from a metabolic health perspective? Well, there are natural things that you can do to increase your metabolic health, to increase your, quote, metabolic flexibility, where you're being able to burn sugar and burning fat. So obviously, taking a look at aging from the perspective of metabolic health, of course, it makes complete sense that we want to maintain and even try to improve or optimize our metabolic health as we get older. And that's going to reverse some of the natural changes of aging. What about body composition? Well, we really spoke about that with functional movement. And of course, having excess body fat, we've learned throughout many different episodes that the fat is just not sitting there. It is releasing all kinds of metabolically active chemicals that are circulating through your body and contributing to a level of inflammation that is going to ultimately contribute to a speeding up of the aging process. So having a good ratio of, a lower body fat percentage is going to be able to help you to reverse some of the, quote, natural aging changes that we see in our population. The fact of the matter is that we need to be active participants in correcting what we can correct, not to necessarily live to 150 years, but to have a quality of life, to be able to be as strong as we possibly can for as long as we can, not with some goal to live forever. As I said, no one knows how long somebody lives. That's something that is very difficult to come to, of course. There's no equation for that. But we can look at it from these 4 different perspectives, and there are many other perspectives we could look at it from. We could look at it from an organ-specific perspective, looking at the heart, or looking at the liver, and see that there are very natural ways of reducing some of the natural, quote, natural changes that happen as you age. And as you learn and you go through this process, you start to think, well, these, quote, natural changes, I mean, how natural are they? You start looking at them as something that, well, yeah, they happen, but they can be pushed out much, much further than we think we can, much more than we think is possible as you learn through this. So with that said, I'd like all of you to consider the concept that aging is something that should be treated, that it is not unnatural, that it is something that you can attack from various different perspectives to be able to increase the quality of your life and to increase your immune system, to be able to fight off infections. And really, that's how I believe you should look at some of the things that we discuss when it comes to aging. Which brings us to really the topic of what we're talking about tonight, which are these zombie cells. And they're called senescent cells. And these senescent cells are called, as I said, zombie cells. So what are they? Well, we've spoken about this briefly, but essentially they're aged cells that have stopped functioning. It's essentially a protection mechanism. I mean, there's a reason for them that, they're diseased, they're old, and unfortunately they haven't died. They've sort of gone into almost like a hibernation state. They're not dividing. Unfortunately, they get to a point where they actually refuse to die. And, we all know that cells often divide and grow. And if it's in an organ, as an example, say the heart, where you need to have a replacement, or any organ that requires new cells, then that's going to actually be a problem, because you're going to need as many cells as possible to be able to replenish and form new cells. So if you have a buildup of these zombie cells that are just sitting there and not doing anything, they're not functioning properly, then that's going to be a problem for an area of your body that's going to require new cells to grow. As you can see, that could potentially be a problem. But it goes beyond that, actually, because what they do is they release inflammatory compounds that damage normal cells. It's sort of the one bad apple that spoils the whole barrel. What happens is you get these senescent cells, these zombie cells, they release inflammatory compounds that actually damage the normal cells around them. So how crazy is this? Of course, as I mentioned, they are trying to essentially defend themselves, but unfortunately what is happening is that they're actually causing more senescent cells. There are certain compounds that have been investigated. One's called apigenin, which is found in celery and is also been incorporated into supplements, that is going to reduce the inflammatory effect of these senescent cells. It doesn't get rid of these cells, but it does reduce the amount of inflammation that's developed from these cells. And if it can do that, then it probably is going to reduce the number of further senescent cells, these further zombie cells, but it's not going to necessarily get rid of the senescent cells itself. It's sort of like calming things down just a little bit. And why are they dangerous? Well, they increase inflammation, of course, as we said, because they're releasing inflammatory compounds, and they're partly responsible for age-related diseases. They can essentially, in some way, probably, when you look at a list of all the diseases that get worse, generally speaking, with age, heart disease and fatty liver disease and various, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, there's no question that they probably contribute in some way to all of these diseases, because you're getting these abnormal buildup of these abnormal zombie cells that are not doing anything and recruiting other zombies, just like a movie, a movie where a zombie bites another person and then that becomes another zombie. It's actually very much like that, unfortunately, and that's happening in our bodies. And when we're younger, our bodies are more capable of getting rid of these senescent cells, these zombie cells. And as we get older, we get a buildup of these, and our bodies are not as effective at getting rid of all of these cells. So this is the problem that we're dealing with. Okay, let's close this down a little bit. And in order to really understand why this is important to the overall aspect of aging, I'd like to go through why these senescent cells have a part to play in sort of an overall understanding of what's happening with the aging process. And so that's why we're going to talk a little bit about some various different topics that we've spoken about before. And we're going to talk about how the activation of all of these different pathways share something in common with what we've spoken about before, which is what are the anti-aging effects of various forms of fasting. The same things that happen with fasting, the same compounds that get rid of these senescent cells, all of these things share a common biological a lot of different common biological pathways, which makes us realize even more importantly, that there is in some way an incredible protective mechanism that happens when we are doing various forms of fasting. Now, I've broken this down into basically four different categories. And many of them we've spoken about before, but we're going to just briefly go through them one more time. So the first one is called AMPK, and this is the master on switch. It's actually, scientists actually call it the master switch of the cell. And if you can imagine, say, a house, the house here would essentially be, the master switch would be like the circuit breaker, or where the power is, it would be the circuit breaker. So you can think of AMPK as being able to turn on, and this is of course a very simplified version, but really we just want to have a general overall understanding. So think about the circuit breaker, that's your AMPK. And the circuit breaker, unfortunately, the ability of that to sort of turn on and off is declining with age. It's like, if you've been in a old house with an old circuit breaker, sometimes it's hard to move those things. The same thing happens with aging. You have a decline in this master switch. It's also associated with metabolic dysfunction. We've spoken about that before. This concept of metabolic dysfunction is basically, how efficient is your body at processing energy? That's the easiest way to think about metabolism. And if you have metabolic dysfunction, probably you're having trouble dealing with perhaps processing of carbohydrates, or processing of fat, or as we spoke about before, the ability to burn fat or burn sugar, or the problems of just burning sugar, or having excess blood sugar. All these different things are going to affect your ability to process energy, let's say. So if AMPK is essentially not working the way it's supposed to, you're going to have metabolic dysfunction, and that is naturally, quote, naturally happening as you age. Next is autophagy. Now, we've spoken about autophagy before as well. This is basically housekeeping. This is where somebody comes into the house, since we'll continue the house analogy, and someone is basically, they see an old chair, doesn't match anymore, it's fallen apart, and we're going to replace it with a brand new chair. So the house is, of course, the house is still old, but it's gotten younger in a certain sense because some of the components inside the house are now newer. That's what housekeeping is. And believe it or not, those compounds that we term senolytics, which we'll talk about at the very end of tonight's episode, are not only activated by fasting, but they're also activated by these compounds called senolytics, those that get rid of these senescent cells. So here we have AMPK, which is also activated by various forms of fasting, which we'll talk about, and senolytics, these compounds that we'll talk about again in a few minutes, also optimize the AMPK, the circuit breaker. Both of these are activated and optimized by senolytic cells and various forms of fasting. Now let's go to the sirtuins. Sirtuins is another we could consider them the balancers and the defenders in the house. So they're essentially making sure the temperature is okay in the house, and making sure the insulation is good in the sense of protecting the house from various forms of insults. And that's what the sirtuins are. Sirtuins, many of you may have heard of them before, only because years ago when resveratrol became a very, very popular supplement, sirtuins were sort of considered to be like the ultimate anti-aging type of process of internal system. Of course, since we've developed sirtuins, all these other factors have become almost more important. And therefore, everyone thought resveratrol was going to be this incredible anti-aging type of chemical. And it does have anti-aging effects because of the activation of these sirtuins. But as you now know from this analogy of the house, well, it's not just enough to have a healthy or optimized or nice house just by having sort of people balancing out the system. We need housekeeping, and we need a functioning circuit breaker as well. And all of these anti-aging pathways have taken time to be able to delineate. And therefore, we're learning more and more about these, quote, natural types of processes in the body and what happens to them as we get older. A lot of supplement makers are now basically reinforcing these sirtuins. And so you see on the market supplements that are marketed with NAD. That's sort of I'd say trendy, very, very trendy supplement these days. And essentially they're working through the sirtuin pathway. You'll see NMN, which is basically a precursor to NAD. You'll see that as a supplement as well. We've spoken about resveratrol as well, but that's not as I said, popular as it used to be. And so it goes with supplements. Every next generation improves on the science as it continues, and new optimizations can continue to evolve. Okay, next we have MTOR, and I call MTOR Mr. Sensitive. Now he's also sort of a balancer and a defender in a sense. And essentially, the reason I call him Mr. Sensitive is because he is influenced really dramatically by basically two things. That's insulin and insulin-like growth factor. Now, we all know about insulin. It's going to go up with sugar, right? It also goes up with animal protein. It goes up really high with cheese. IGF-1 is similar in that sense, that sugar and animal protein are both going to raise mTOR. And this from an article, a really great article on mTOR by a Stallone, not Sylvester, but another Stallone. And he wrote the most robust mediator, speaking about mTOR, it is the most robust mediator of the protective effects of various forms of dietary restriction, which has been shown to extend lifespan and slow the onset of age-related diseases across species. So what he's saying really is that this is, when it comes to anti-aging and fasting, and dietary manipulation or dietary change, this is the most robust mediator of the effects that have been shown to extend lifespan across various species. So that would mean that we don't want mTOR to be super activated. It's super activated, again, by animal protein, and of course, because it's influenced by insulin, sugar as well. So we've spoken about this at length, and I don't want to belabor the point, but it has been shown that especially as you're getting older, that animal protein needs to be monitored. And in my patients, I actually order an IGF-1 level because you can actually measure IGF-1 to be able to see if you're eating too much, if you're eating too much animal protein, or for other reasons, for example, eating too much sugar that's raising insulin that may also raise IGF-1. Essentially, you can dial in the amount of animal protein that works for you, and that has been shown to be associated with the least mortality. Believe it or not, there's an incredible study to show that there's a sweet spot. Too little is not too good, and too much is not too good. And the same thing could be said for MTOR, which is not really something that's measured, but IGF-1 is. But the same thing goes. You don't want MTOR to be too low. You don't want MTOR to be too high. Another note of caution with sort of manipulation of mTOR is that if you're over the age of 65, it's, your need for protein levels do increase. And so after the age of 65, it's not as important to watch the amount of animal protein that you eat. Nonetheless, you could still get an IGF-1 and see how it's doing. So this is activated, of course, if you're on, say, a fast, because you're not eating anything that is triggering either of these, then your mTOR is going to be suppressed, and that's what's shown to extend lifespan and slow the onset of age-related diseases. We've spoken about fasting mimicking diets, and the same thing goes. We've spoken about how you can do a 5-day fast, mimicking fast, called biological fasting, where you reduce the amount of calories and you reduce the animal protein. So it's a vegan, low-calorie diet for 5 days, and you can get the same sort of thing going on. You can get, your housekeeper or coming in and replacing your old chairs. You're going to have an increase in your sirtuins. Your master switch is going to be optimized, and your mTOR is going to be suppressed. And guess what? The same thing happens when you are working. The same thing happens with senolytics, and a lot of reason why people call some of the senolytics calorie restriction mimetics, or those things that mimic the effect of a fast, is because they're activating all the same things that we're talking about. So this overactivation of mTOR also contributes to creating these cells that we're talking about, these zombie cells. So if mTOR is totally overactivated, then in addition to not being able to optimize your body for extended lifespan, you're also creating the environment for cells to come in and to destroy themselves. It's almost like you had a chair in your house, that was basically, affecting all the other furniture and growing on the walls. Like you had almost like an infection in your house is contributing to these senolytic cells. So as I said, why is this important? Because senolytics and, excuse me for 1 second. Okay, sorry. Senolytic cells and fasting and calorie restriction essentially optimize these levels. So that's what these shared pathways are. I know we've spoken about them before, but I think it's, I haven't really used, I was thinking about over the last couple of days, sort of an analogy to be able to put all these into effect. So mTOR is Mr. Sensitive. He's going to be sensitive to animal protein, and he's going to be sensitive to sugar. You have housekeeping, so this autophagy where you're, remember, replacing old chairs or replacing the refrigerator. The house itself is still old, but the internal functioning of the house is good. Sort of like when they, gut a house, and of course the outside of the house is old, but inside it's new. And that's what's happening with autophagy. And then the master switch, which we spoke about as well. All right, so we're gonna finish up tonight talking about the zombie killers, and these are called senolytics. And lytic, of course, means death, so killing senolytic cells. So I call them zombie killers. Okay, so today we'll probably end a little sooner but I'm trying to focus, we've spoken a lot about all of these things and in a very great depth from a very different lens. And so now I'm trying to focus in on very specific topics so you can understand them. And hopefully I'll share helpful analogies so that you can get an understanding of what's going on in the process. Okay, well, there are basically 4 senolytics that have been studied. And this is a medication. This is a medication. I believe this was originally a leukemia medication. This was, I believe, also some kind of cancer medication. And then quercetin, which is found in lots of vegetables, and fisetin, which is found in strawberries and other types of vegetables and fruits, is also a senolytics. Now, a lot of people are in the anti-aging movement, I guess you could say. Some doctors are actually prescribing. Essentially, there was one very good study that basically combined dasatinib and quercetin, which showed a reduction in the amount of senolytic cells, of senescent cells. And therefore, there are a fair number of anti-aging doctors who actually prescribe dasatinib and quercetin together. And it's not something I would recommend. I think they need more studies for that, but no question that these two in combination have been shown for that. Whether I would want to take, even at low dose, something like dasatinib, I probably wouldn't. Quercetin, which has been in the news lately because of COVID, it functions in many different ways. I put this just to remind myself to mention it, but an ionophore is basically a property where it allows things to get into the cell. So in the news recently, quercetin was sort of a trending topic early on in the COVID epidemic, because quercetin allows zinc to actually get into the cells. So if zinc can't get into the cells, then obviously it's not going to do what it's supposed to do. Now, quercetin is found in lots of different vegetables. Some people take quercetin for many different. There are many effects for quercetin, as you can say with just about every phytochemical, found in a fruit or a vegetable. The Life Extension Foundation actually has a quercetin and black tea supplement that people take once a week, which is supposed to have senolytic effects. And I'm impressed with that product and the data that they have. And I take it myself, and I actually recommended my parents to take it as well. So it's a combination of quercetin and a black tea extract. It's supposed to get rid of some of these cells. I don't have any sort of association with Life Extension Foundation, but that is a product that I do recommend, because I'm not going to be recommending anybody to take this. And certainly quercetin and black tea is certainly not going to be harmful. Now, fisetin is also been shown to get rid of these cells. And since we just spoke about Life Extension Foundation, this one has been known for several years to be a very potent senolytic, but it basically is very difficult to get to absorb and to stay in your bloodstream for any significant period of time. So, but I have to say that actually the Life Extension Foundation just released several months ago a very bioavailable fisetin, and the question remains right now. And this is a very natural product, of course. As I said, it's found in strawberries and other sorts of fruits and vegetables. The question is what's the appropriate dose of taking fisetin? Eventually, they'll come up with a protocol that will probably be a combination of fisetin and quercetin and black tea extract that's probably going to, but unfortunately, this new bioavailable supplement is new. And so they're going to have to do some studies to get to the bottom of how effective that is or isn't in combination. But that's very exciting. And I think what you're going to see is you're going to start seeing this, especially in anti-aging expert doctors who are recommending various protocols for their CEO patients that that are demanding some sort of anti-aging type of protocol. Navitoclax, again, it's a medication, so I don't know of anyone who is taking that, but in the lab, it's been shown to also be a senolytic. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that people are also taking an anti-cancer medication by the name of rapamycin at a low dose, often with quercetin and dasatinib. These are people who are like really into this, to suppress mTOR, and then taking these to be able to reduce, to get rid of the senolytics. Again, I don't recommend that. I recommend, obviously, for most people to do a sequence of biological fasting a couple times a year, which is that 5-day fast, which, by the way, we'll be re-releasing our program in probably around a month, which will come with a complete 3-month educational program that is paired with 5 days each month of the diet, with a support group and a nutritionist and a whole bunch of support. And I'm very excited about relaunching that particular program. So stay tuned for that. And with that, you can get suppression of mTOR just by doing these essentially 5-day fasts. And you don't have to do them more than, essentially you do it once a month for 3 months, and then you only have to do it every 3 to 4 months thereafter. And this causes you to, without any change in your diet, a suppression of your mTOR, as well as an activation of AMPK, as well as that housekeeper's coming in, and the housekeeper and carpenter coming in and replacing all those old chairs and sofas and giving you a new TV, and also affecting the sirtuins, all of those things. So you combine that, of course, where you're getting all that kind of activation, and you combine that with some obviously good eating. And if you want to add the quercetin black tea or the fisetin, then that's also an option as well. But my point in linking these two things is that you can get activation of all of these things by really, one, if you just look at mTOR, okay, you're over 65, then don't worry too much about animal protein, but of course worry about sugar intake. If you're under 65 and you want to really optimize this, be careful with animal protein and consider talking to your doctor or contact me and looking into IGF-1. And the same thing goes with everything that I've talked about. AMPK, you can activate with gynostemma, which I've spoken about it many times, where you can buy gynostemma tea, which is really good at activating AMPK. All these things run together, which makes you realize that paying attention to Mr. Sensitive here is going to be a good idea for you, and obviously incorporating some sort of fasting strategy in some way. And now their fasting strategies are getting easier and easier and easier as we learn more about how to simulate fasting without having to completely refrain from eating. This is a continuing process. The original studies were done, as I've said before, by a doctor at USC who really has sort of figured this out. But as time goes by, maybe you don't need 5 days. The original studies were done with 5 days. People go through it and they have a great time of it. They feel incredibly good. I do it myself once a quarter, and I can tell you that you feel absolutely incredible when you finish this. And you realize partially because your blood sugar is incredibly stable for those 5 days, and for many people it's actually the first time in their life that their blood sugar is not going up and down. And we don't realize the emotional toll, believe it or not. Yeah, emotional toll that can actually take, because when your blood sugar goes up and when it drops down, that is going to cause abnormal types of cravings. And none of us even really have an idea of how much our mood our energy, all of these things have been impacted by a lifetime of blood sugar going up and down, not to mention having the inability to be able to burn fat. Once your body can burn fat, then it can switch from burning sugar to burning fat easier. Therefore, you can lose weight easier just with those 5 days. And the results of doing this a couple times is that it lasts for months. So it's really an incredible process. I'll certainly be talking about it more, especially once we launch the program, relaunch the program. And I'm really excited to share that with you. So that is tonight's episode. I appreciate everyone's attention. If anyone has any questions, do let me know. Thank you all for staying in tonight's episode. I do appreciate that. And I hope you found it valuable, just to understand really that you shouldn't feel in any way as if you're doing something unnatural because you're trying to reverse some of the natural processes that happen as you get older. And that you can make substantial changes in this by really focusing on various different strategies. Thank you, Terry, for that comment. All right, so thank you everyone for your attention. I do appreciate your attention. Next week, we're actually gonna be talking about heavy metals and the impact of heavy metals on your health. They don't impact everyone. There's some people that they impact more than others. And we'll talk about what the role of those heavy metals is in things like diabetes, as well as just your general overall feeling of wellness and where heavy metals are hidden in the environment, and a whole host of things related to cleaning up your environment and understanding how heavy metals, as well as some other toxins, impact your overall health. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you next week, and I hope you all stay well. Thanks again.